Good afternoon and welcome to CCK Facebook Live at Home. Today we're going to be talking about depression and anxiety. Before we dive in, we do want to know if you are a veteran or a family member of a veteran, a friend, and are experiencing crisis, please reach out and call the Veterans Crisis Line at 1-800-273-8255 and press 1. This is not just for veterans who are having a mental health crisis, but really any life crisis. They can get you assistance and point you in the right direction. Again, that's for veterans or friends or family members of veterans. With that, I just want to take a quick moment to introduce ourselves. I'm Emma Peterson, and today I'm joined with Bethany Cook and with Nicholas Briggs. And we're going to be talking, like I said, about depression and anxiety. Depression is probably one of the second most common service-connected mental health disorder among veterans. So we wanted to talk a little bit about how you go about getting service-connected and how about VA goes about rating that disability. So Nick, how would a veteran establish service connection for depression or anxiety?
As always, there are three basic elements to service connection. First and foremost, the veteran needs to have a current diagnosis of the condition. Then there needs to be some kind of in-service event, disease, or injury. And then there needs to be medical evidence linking the two. So oftentimes we see situations where a veteran is diagnosed with depression and anxiety, but they're still they still need to establish that the condition is related to something that happened in their service. That can come through a number of different ways that we'll talk about later. But one of the most important distinctions is that it doesn't need to involve a stressor. One of the more common mental health disabilities that we see is post-traumatic stress disorder. And in those situations, VA requires credible evidence of a stressor that occurred in service. But a stressor isn't required to establish service connection for depression. We're really talking about any specific psychological symptoms that manifested during the veteran's service that they still experience now.
So what are some examples? You mentioned the three elements, one of which being in-service occurrence. What are some examples of, in-service causes of depression or anxiety? Does it have to be due to service or due to a military activity?
No, absolutely not. It just needs to have happened during service. Again, there are some situations where there might be a stressor that depression and anxiety could be related to. But oftentimes we see that a veteran is experiencing problems that aren't directly related to the military that still affect their functioning during service. For example, if the veteran is deployed to another country and they're experiencing problems with their family at home, they might become depressed and anxious over their inability to do anything to help their family while they're stationed abroad. So even if the factors causing their symptoms in service aren't in and of themselves related to that service, as long as the symptoms manifested during their period of active duty, there's still a means through which they can get service connection granted.
Now, what if your depression was caused by, let's say, you're service connected for a really bad back disability? You're in constant pain, you can't walk, and that leads to depression. Is that something that veterans can file for service connection?
Absolutely. That's what's called secondary service connection, where the underlying service-connected condition that's causing the depression basically serves as a placeholder for the typical in-service occurrence. So as long as there's some kind of medical and lay evidence supporting the connection between the hypothetical veteran's severe back disability and their depression arising from maybe their inability to do activities that they used to enjoy, things like that, that's certainly a means through which service connection can be granted as well.
Now, sometimes you might not know, what condition you exactly have. I know we have a lot of clients and there are a lot of folks out there who might be diagnosed with multiple conditions. Sometimes depression and anxiety go hand in hand. Do you have to file claims for both? Can you just file generally? If you have two conditions, so I have to get two claims going. What can a veteran do if they, one, don't know what they have, or two, they've got a lot of different diagnoses in their record?
For sure. Obviously, veterans typically aren't, qualified psychological experts. So from a certain perspective, they're not going to know what their exact diagnosis is. All they can really attest to are the symptoms that they experience and how they affect them. And because of that, VA has a duty to liberally construe a veteran's claim. This was covered in the court's Clemens decision, which basically says even if the veteran files a service connection claim for a particular disability, like PTSD, if there are other psychological diagnoses of record, the board is still required to consider whether or not those diagnoses are related to service, even if the one this veteran specifically claimed isn't shown in the medical evidence.
Okay. Does VA, diagnose or evaluate? How do they go about diagnosing and evaluate the severity of a veteran's, depression or anxiety?
Sure. So from a diagnostic perspective, they rely on the DSM-5. So for PTSD, there's obviously the criteria requiring a stressor. That's criterion A. But major depressive disorder, other depressive disorders, and other anxiety disorders all have their own separate diagnostic criteria. And as long as the veteran's particular symptoms meet the frequency and duration requirements outlined for those conditions in the DSM, they can still be diagnosed with those conditions. And then from there, once the diagnosis is reached, the VA will apply what's called the general formula for rating mental health conditions, which we'll go into more detail on, obviously.
Right. So Bethany, we've gotten service connection for our veteran for depression or anxiety. How does VA go about using that general rating criteria that Nick just talked about? How do they go about doing that and assigning a rating for a veteran with one of these mental health conditions?
Sure. So like Nick said, how the VA rates depression and anxiety is using the general rating formula for mental health conditions. This is the rating criteria that the VA uses for all mental health conditions. The ratings range from 0, 10, 30, 50, 70, or 100%. And the VA bases these ratings on the occupational and social impairment that the conditions cause. So the VA is going to assign a rating based on the severity. The 0% rating is the least severe. If the VA awards a 0% rating, they're saying that the veteran has a diagnosis that the condition is due to service, and the condition is due to service, but the symptoms don't impair social or occupational functioning at all, or require any medication. So a 0% rating, of course, isn't going to result in any compensation for the veteran. And then moving from there, the 10% rating is the next least severe. So with a 10% rating, the symptoms of depression and or anxiety are mild. Periods of high stress might cause minor social or occupational impairment, but essentially the VA is saying the condition isn't severe enough to cause any major occupational or social impairment. So it goes at that point from 30% to 50%. The 30% is just a step above 10%. The symptoms might be a little bit more severe, but the VA is still saying that the condition doesn't cause major occupational or social impairment. And the 50% rating is where the VA is saying that the condition causes regular impairment of work or social skills. So with a 50% rating, a veteran might still be able to work, but the condition is causing some impairment. The next highest rating is the 70% rating. This is where the rating criteria says that the condition is causing impairment in most areas, such as work, school, social relationships, judgment, thinking, and or mood. The symptoms that a 70% rating might manifest with would be suicidal ideation, obsessional rituals that interfere with routine activities, near continuous panic and or depression, and these symptoms are causing interference in independent functioning. So a 70% rating is still not the most severe, even though it is causing impairment in most areas. The highest rating is the 100% rating, and that's what the VA is saying the condition is causing total occupational and social impairment. So based on the rating criteria, a veteran who has a 100% disability rating, the VA is saying that they would essentially not be able to have any kinds of social relationships or be able to function in a work environment. How the rating criteria works is beyond just how the VA is saying what level of social and occupational impairment the condition causes. Each rating criteria also includes a list of symptoms that the rating kind of correlates with. But there is a case law, it's also in the VA's regulations that this list of symptoms are not exhaustive. So it's more how the VA will rate disability as what rating would best approximate the severity of the veteran's disability.
Okay. Now, I'm going to make a quick commentary here on that 0% criteria, because this has always bothered me, and I don't know if it bothers you, Bethany, or you, Nick, but for those criteria for diagnosing someone with anxiety or depression, one of the criteria is that it causes clinically significant distress, I believe, if I'm using the right term, or something along those lines. So in my opinion, I'm not quite sure how you have a diagnosis and it's not causing you any impairment whatsoever at all, but that's just me. I would certainly suggest that you reach out to a veteran service organization, an accredited representative, or attorney, whoever you're working with on your claim, if you do get granted service connection for one of these conditions and are assigned a 0% rating. But that's just my 2 cents on the issue. All right, moving right along. Nick, if I have 2 conditions, like we talked about, I've got depression and anxiety, is VA going to award me 2 ratings? Am I going to get, a 30% for my depression and a 30% for my anxiety? How does that work?
So like we talked about at the beginning, VA uses for most mental health disabilities a general formula. And because the formula is meant to apply to all sorts of different diagnoses, you're not going to get separate ratings for depression on the one hand and anxiety on the other. Rather, you're going to get a single disability rating under the formula that accommodates and considers all of your particular symptoms. If you look back at the 30% criteria that Bethany mentioned, you'll see both depressed mood, anxiety, and panic attacks listed under the same part of the rating schedule. So it's not a matter of getting separate ratings for each condition. It's really a matter of figuring out what the severity of those symptoms are, and then from there determining what the rating should be based off of the occupational and social impairment they cause. That's not to say that there aren't certain mental health conditions that can be rated separately. VA does have a separate set of criteria for eating disorder specifically. So there are certain circumstances where there might be separate rating involved, but they're pretty few and far between. For the most part, the conditions are going to be rated together.
Now, Bethany, what if depression and anxiety prevent you from working? What happens then?
Yeah, so you might have noticed when I was talking about the rating criteria that how the VA is thinking when they are kind of defining the different ratings themselves is talking about occupational and social impairment. So the 100% rating was total social and occupational impairment. And it might be difficult to show that. So a veteran's depression and anxiety could be extremely severe, but only get the 70% rating because maybe they're still able to kind of have social relationships. So that's where you can apply for a different benefit. So with the total disability rating based on individual unemployability, shortening TDIU, that's a benefit that gets the veteran compensated at the 100% rate if they are unable to work, obtain substantially gainful employment due to their service-connected disabilities. So in theory, a veteran could, maybe they're underrated at 30% or 50%. But if they can show that they're unable to work due to their depression and anxiety, even if it is pretty lowly rated, TDIU would be an alternative way to get compensated at the 100% rate. With a 70% rating based on the severity of those symptoms, it's a little bit, it can be a little bit more kind of straightforward obtaining the TDIU benefit based on the requirements for TDIU. But it is an option for a veteran to get compensated at the 100% rate, even if their disability isn't rated at 100%.
Now, what is some evidence, both Bethany and Nick practice at our agency as accredited reps. What are some evidence that is helpful for our veterans that are seeking depression and anxiety, a service connection or an increased rating? What's some evidence that you all look for and try to develop?
So one of the most important, oh, go ahead, Bethany.
I was just going to say medical evidence. That's probably the one of the most important. How the VA will often rate disabilities is based on their VA compensation and pension exams. So having your private medical records or your records from your treating physicians at the VA medical centers, that can be a way to kind of show the severity that your condition manifests with on a daily basis.
Yep, absolutely. In addition to that, we often find many of the veterans that we work with and represent don't treat as often as other veterans do for whatever reason. Oftentimes they might be isolating and living in remote areas that make it difficult to seek treatment regularly. And for that reason, in addition to the usual medical evidence that you can get from a treating doctor, we also like to gather lay evidence from both the veteran themselves, as well as any family members or friends that know them and know how their symptoms affect them on a day-to-day basis. Because oftentimes, like Bethany mentioned, VA is going to rate the condition based solely off of the four corners of the VA examination. But oftentimes the veteran might be downplaying or otherwise failing to report certain symptoms at the time of the VA exam. And at the end of the day, that's just a single snapshot of the veteran's functioning during that particular examination on that particular day. So any evidence that you can provide from friends and family regarding your functioning over the course of months or years is going to go a long way in making sure that VA rates your condition properly.
And piggybacking off of what Nick said, the friends and family lay statements are very important because, this stuff can be hard to talk about with a stranger at a VA exam that, you've never seen before. They're not there to treat you necessarily. And so opening up about these very personal issues is not an easy thing to do. So having a statement from your spouse, a sibling, a parent, whoever's in your life, your neighbor, who sees you and can provide a really clear, accurate picture of what your symptoms are like and how it impairs you day to day can be really helpful and often provide a more realistic picture of what's going on rather than, as Nick said, a snapshot of, how you were with a stranger for a few minutes in an exam room on one day. Do you all have any closing tips or thoughts for folks out there that are listening to this broadcast?
It's worth keeping in mind that just like with other service-connected disabilities, getting that 100% rating or getting TDIU might not necessarily be the end of the question or all of the benefits that you could be entitled to. There are certain situations where the veteran might need the aid and attendance of another person, either because they're a threat to themselves, a threat to others, or because they need the assistance from another person to do even some of the most basic activities like bathing and dressing. And in those situations, it would be worth considering pursuing special monthly compensation. So there's always that additional benefit to keep in mind if you think that your condition is even more severe than TDIU or a 100% rating might encompass.
Bethany, any closing thoughts or tips?
I would just echo, I think you said it earlier, Emma, that if you believe that the VA did underrate, if you got service connection and you did believe that the VA is underrating your psychiatric disability, that can be a really good time to seek representation, whether it be with a VSO or with a private law firm, to assist you in getting the evidence that you need to combat the rating that the VA has assigned, or as well as in assisting you in obtaining a higher benefit like TDIU or SMC, as Nick said.
Okay, great. So one more time, I'm just going to tell you all the Veterans Crisis Line in case anyone needs it. It's 1-800-273-8255. Again, that's for you as a veteran, or if you are a friend or family member of a veteran that's in crisis, please reach out to them and they would be happy to assist you in whatever way they can. If you have any questions or thoughts about our Facebook Live today, please feel free to post them in the comments and we will try to get back to you just as soon as we can. In the meantime, feel free to check out our website at cck-law.com. Look at our blog. We have a lot further and more in-depth discussion about these various mental health disabilities. But with that, we are going to sign off. Once again, I'm Emma Peterson, joined today by Nicholas Briggs and Bethany Cook. And thank you for joining us for another episode of CCK Live.